and it might be yourself here in this room, but it's about the community. There's a lot of work that goes in to these projects, as some of you would know. Then I'm going to talk about some risk assessment and how we approached it with the rail trail, and I'm going to whiz into these photos of design and construction. Part one is the planning. And this is typically how a conversation goes when I was on that project for 5 years. How much does the rail trail cost, and is it feasible? And I would always say to people, I don't know, what do you want it to achieve? And they'd say, what do you mean? I thought you were fixing some bridges and putting down some gravel. Well, I don't think that's very feasible. And it probably wouldn't have been if that's what we did. So it's an important thing to consider up front in that early planning stage. Why are you doing it? Who are you doing it for? How are you going to achieve that operationally? How are you going to bring the community on board? So there are some key elements or dimensions that I think when you're looking at that early stage that are pivotal, that flows into every other stage that comes. Now, I've been very careful and cognizant not to go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, because it's an organic process. The first one, technical feasibility, involves evaluating whether the project can be completed within the available technology and the resources that your organisation, your government might have. The availability of the necessary tools. And most of you are probably aware at a local government level, we're usually under-resourced. And so that's our first challenge. Economic feasibility is the one that most people talk about and think about. It's the dimension that focuses on the financial aspect of the project. It involves the cost-benefit analysis, estimating the project's costs. It includes assessing the project's profitability or its net benefit return. It's very difficult to do that if you don't imagine what the outcome will look like. The legal feasibility involves ensuring that the project complies with all the relevant laws, permits, approvals. This was an interesting one for the Tweeds case because we didn't own the asset, it was owned by the state government. So we had to enter into a lease agreement, a long-term lease with the state government to access the corridor and to do the rail trail. I didn't find out for about 6 months after agreeing to take over the project that we couldn't actually do it because the law didn't allow for it. And so that was the first step, was to let's change the law. And I can tell you that was not an easy process dealing with state government. But we got there. We got there. Optimism. The operational feasibility examines whether the project can be integrated into existing organisational structures. And this will probably come up more and more when we talk about governance. It doesn't fit well with a council's organisational structure because we don't allow for this kind of activity. We manage lots of other public assets, libraries, swimming pools and things like that. But the rail trail is altogether different. Market feasibility. This dimension looked at the demand for the project's output in the market and the impacts of competition. The BVRT is competition for the rail trail in New South Wales. And we paid close attention to this. Luckily for me, I ride it and have been for probably 12 years, so I'm very familiar with it. And by the way, I don't know, whoever is managing it at the moment, it's great to see the surface being improved. Kudos to you. It's a much easier ride. Social feasibility. This considers the project's impact on society and the community. And there are pros and cons with this, and we heard, I think it was Craig talking about it earlier. You get a lot of concerns about security. Someone's going to ride down the trail, they're going to jump over the fence and steal my lawnmower. Good luck with that one. The other side of it is the well-being. It improves livability. There is a lot of studies out there, quite empirical studies, that show that when you've got this kind of asset and the people are using it, it relieves some of the pressure on our medical services. So there are enormous health benefits and tax savings in dollars. It's important to have that when you're looking at a feasibility assessment. Those bits often get dropped off, but they're the bits that count. Environmental feasibility evaluates the project's environmental and impact and sustainability. Again, this was an issue for the Tweed one because we have a microhabitat in one of our tunnels. So one of our tunnels is 524 metres long. It's very dark, it's cold and it's damp, so it's got glowworms. It's also got microbats in there. So we had to consider those very carefully. Risk feasibility, Identifying and assessing potential risks associated with the project includes developing risk management strategies. You all know what a risk matrices looks like, but making sure that you've got one that's comprehensive and that you keep up to date, it's absolutely critical. It's also things like probity plans. When you're dealing with elected members, non-elected members, different members of government at different levels, community groups and others, making sure that you protect yourself and your team is paramount. By considering these dimensions, project feasibility can be comprehensively evaluated to determine whether a project is viable and worth pursuing. And it is the backbone to your business case, and it is the number one tool for political advocacy. And when I say political advocacy, I also mean social advocacy. So the NRRT, for those that don't know, had significant opposition to it. There was a lot of different groups that formed, held rallies, threatened to chain themselves to the railway track and all the usual business. But we weren't perturbed by that. It was about being informed and not buying into the rhetoric that came from nowhere and that was unsubstantiated. So building an evidence base with all of those dimensions is how you move forward. We naturally did it because we needed funding. We couldn't afford the project on our own. So project feasibility and viability are the two crucial concepts in project management and business analysis, each serving a distinct purpose in the evaluation of a project. Your feasibility focuses on the practicality and possibility of completing the project. What is the best way to execute and achieve that? And your viability focuses on the strategic benefits, market potential, and long-term success of the project. Is it worth doing? Now I'm going to move into a bunch of slides, which I might move, it's a bit more organic. I'm not going to read off this paper. We might move through that quite quickly. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them as I go. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of sow the seed of what does that planning in the early stage look like when you take these dimensions into consideration, and what does that translate into as you develop through the project and then ultimately when the project is completed. So the first one is you need support. You need a lot of support. Probably a lot more support than you think you do at the outset. And it's hard work. I mean, it really is hard yakka. The amount of letters that we had to write, and of course every time you write a letter you've got to respond to one, or respond to two, or respond to three, because it's going off all over the place. But you need to stick at it. Getting the support, informing the community and trying to bring them on the journey, even when they're hostile. I lost track of how many community workshops I had. Every single one of them was worth it. And I do have a tendency to digress and wander off. I'll try not to too much. But to give you an example of that, we had a number of landowners, of which we had 77 in total. And they were in total opposition to this project. They wanted the train back. They wanted anything back as long as it wasn't a rail trail. I go riding on there after work. I was on there last night when I finished work, jumped out for an hour or two. And those very people are out there with their family riding their bikes. And I have to say, I've noticed the number of them are getting thinner and thinner. So once you start to build up that support, you've got to do some of the hard yards around your business case. So for us to secure that funding at a state and a federal level, we need to do a demand analysis, then we need to do an economic analysis. We've already looked at all our social dimensions, our position in the marketplace, and we pull all of that together in a business case. And the most critical aspect of that business case is the alignment with local, regional and state government policy. Because without that, you're not going anywhere. But if you can demonstrate that you've got that, and that you've got a net benefit, it's very hard for any government to say, no, we're not going to fund you. Once you've got that, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of your funding, you dig in, bunker down, and get on with the rest of the job. There's a lot of heritage in the NRRT, which meant there was a lot of consultancy work that needed to be undertaken, understanding what we had, what we could keep, what we could change, what we could get rid of, working with the state government through the Heritage Office to make sure that they were on the same page with us, This is all leading into that design phase. I mean, you can hypothesize about the type of bridge you're going to have or the surface you're going to have. You don't know what you're dealing with this up front. Everything will change for you later on. Had to change the state government laws, the statutes, the transport legislation. Also had to change the council's local environmental plan, because that didn't allow for this either. And what it did allow for required development consent. And if any of you have ever dealt with a council, the last thing you want is a DA, trust me. And I was the same with the rail trial, thinking about it operationally going forward. Who wants to lodge a DA every time you want to do something? So we changed that, and now you can do things without consent. I was a little bit optimistic up front. I put in a whole list of things. You can do all these things without consent, thinking the government's going to turn around and say, over our dead body. But they didn't. I don't know why, but we managed to get it through. I talked about the probity plan and the importance of that. The importance of making sure that you check rules that might not ordinarily be in front of you that you're thinking about. So this was another one, the capital expenditure guidelines, state government policy. It required us to do a lot of reporting, which apparently we've never done before, even though it's been around since whatever the date is on there, 2010. So we do, like most councils, multi-million-dollar projects. We hadn't reported a single one. Just by chance that I was working on this one, and I thought, oh, what's that? I've never seen that before. Oh, wish I'd never seen it at all. So that was an interesting one. And to put that into perspective, once I was aware of that and then engaged with a rather interesting battle with the Department of Local Government, to which we were successful, it meant that a couple of our projects were put under the microscope. And to do the reporting on some of our other projects, so for example, we were doing a new dog pound. $80,000 it cost us to get a consultant to do that piece of work. Now, I got away with it in the rail trial because I said, well, we don't have the money. And we've already programmed in what we're going to be doing, and there isn't $80,000 there to go and do a report to tell you what all my other reports do. So I packaged up everything we had, and we put it in an envelope, and we sent it to them and said, that's it. They accepted it. But it's something to bear in mind. I don't know if you have a similar thing here in Queensland, but if you're operating elsewhere in the state, these things pop up very unexpectedly. The beauty is when you get all of those things right and you get them in place up front, it helps you deal with some of the peripheral issues. So on the right-hand side on this screen, this beautiful little picture of I don't know what you want to call it, a hippie train. Thank you, hippie train. This is Byron Shire Council. Similarly to us, they had a lot of opposition, but they also had a lot of ideas about what they could do. They wanted a multi-use rail corridor where you could have everything. Now, on our corridor, it's simply not going to work. It's narrow, it's winding, ours is a little bit hilly, very, very difficult terrain, high biodiversity. There was no way you're going to get away with what they wanted here. But you can't just say, no, sorry, it doesn't work. You need to have the evidence to support it. So all of those things I've spoken about, building on the evidence base, is what we used when we met with Byron Shire Council and said, well, thank you for that, but here's the truth. They wanted these. The other thing that was paramount in my mind, and I was incredibly lucky that our council has a fantastic comms team, and a lot of councils don't, a lot of organisations don't, was when I was going out to these community groups, we kept talking about a rail trail. Now you might think that's okay, because it is a rail trail, but no one really knows what it is. Right? So it needed an identity, it needed a brand, it needed a distraction, it needed to be something else. So early on, consulting with our comms team, with Tiffany, was we needed a brand. And the brand became intrinsically important as I went through that project. I stopped talking about the rail trail, I started talking about the Northern Rivers Rail Trail because it is an experience. And we were getting this information out wherever we could. We were using the logo when we were going out to have those information sessions, and we were planting the seed. This isn't just about old men in Lycra riding backwards and forwards. This is about community. It's about the economy. And that really began to stick. And once that did stick, the narrative changed. This is how we're going to use it and incorporate it. Let's talk about some risk assessment. So there were some big ticket items on our trail, and one of the things I I'm an avid researcher. I research everything, luckily. And I reached out to a lot of rail trails domestically and internationally. I was fortunate that I grew up in the UK. I rode on rail trails to get to school. I know what they are, I know what they look like, and I know who uses them. But I reached out to everyone, anyone, to understand how they go and how they work everywhere else. And one thing that became very apparent, there wasn't a single issue that I was dealing with that hasn't been dealt with before. And it's really unfortunate that that information isn't documented and captured. New South Wales Government had a go while we were doing this particular project. They engaged a consultant and they ultimately prepared their regional trail plan for New South Wales, which is a blueprint as to how to approach it. So we were quite instrumental in guiding and shaping that. Unfortunately, it didn't capture all of the detail, but I can tell you when you get stuck on an issue, you just reach out, pick up the phone, there's someone there who's already done it. Very, very helpful. But for us, we had biosecurity issues. We had an issue with our station platform because it was a little bit high and apparently everyone was just going to turn up to the trail and fall off the end. It had been there since 1891. No reported incidents. There's something about rail trails and people just falling off high places. The Burrung Range Tunnel, that's 524 metres long. We've got a number of road crossings, horse riding. See that on the BVRT regularly. There's a couple of issues with horse riding. We might sort of get into that. Trail design, surface selection, your signage, your litter, your security, your telecommunications, your water. Your environment is very harsh. I've had a few moments out on the trail in remote areas when it's 33 degrees and your body decides, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. So having information about what your trail is like in your particular environment is critical, because like ours, we can't have water stations every 100 metres, and there's no bathrooms, and there's no bins. Vandalism hasn't been so much of an issue, but it occurs from time to time. And similarly to what TMR was saying this morning, we've got 77 adjoining landowners. Many of them farm intergenerationally within that corridor. And that was one of my biggest challenges when I took on there. But through conversations with the right people, with the councillors, we come to an understanding. We want to support our businesses. We don't want to put them out of business. So the question is, how can you do that and run a rail trail at the same time? And when we talk about operational costs, it's a bit of a no-brainer. If I can ask somebody to take out a lease on 10,000 square metres and mow it for me regularly, I don't have to pay that. They're doing it instead. And that's what we've been doing. So we've allowed opportunities for economic businesses to come in there, but we've also made sure that we've limited our financial exposure by getting other people to do that work while they benefit from having use of that land. Biosecurity, it is a big ticket issue, and I know it is up here. I've seen work done in and around southeast Queensland as well as across New South Wales state. The first thing we did is we engaged local land services, we got the district vet involved, and then we prepared a very comprehensive biosecurity plan. Because that's where the anger comes from. It's when they're looking for something to latch onto, it will be the microbats in the tunnel, it will be the biosecurity threat, people coming from China, all manner of things. So getting this work done in advance was pivotal, and this is before we went into the detailed design of the actual trail itself. Research. I don't know how many stations I've looked at, but it was important to document all of them and then prepare a risk matrices associated with that to guide our own decisions. As it turns out, I had a cheap solution, because one of the problems we had is the height required a balustrade, and the balustrade required state government approval because it's a state significant heritage item, and they said, well, you're not doing that. Well, that's okay. So we'll just fill up the ballast to meet the minimum threshold of the height, and all those regulations just drop off. So it's talking to the right people, having the right people on your team. The tunnel. Same thing, there was a lot of calls there for the tunnel to be fully lit. All manner of designs and options were put to us, but at the end of the day, I would say that If there's one aspect of the trail that most people talk about and is memorable, is riding through that tunnel. Yeah, it is a little bit risky. We've had a few broken bones, but overall, people survive. And I'm glad we didn't go down that path of lighting the tunnel. So the one on the left is about 40 metres in from one of the entrance with no light, and this is one with just a pretty standard bike light, to not 1,000 lumens or anything ridiculous like that. But it gives you some idea. You can see where you're going. If you moderate your speed, it's likely to be safe. So the horses. When we set out on doing this particular project, we wanted to allow horses where we could. Ideally, we would do it in an off-formation bridle way. But because of the nature of ours, unlike yours, the Brisbane Valley Trail, we just simply don't have the room to do it. There was no continuity, which meant that there was no point. But to get over that hurdle because of the lobby group required a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of documentation. We put down a 200-metre trial surface, knowing that someone was going to take their horse on there, and they did. And that provided enough evidence to demonstrate the damage that the horses do. Now, when you don't have CapEx flowing in to maintain this, operational funding, capital money, you need to make sure that you design for something that's going to be durable. So if you've got something that's durable, but for the horse, that's a problem. And that was a problem for us. So it took a lot of work to get through that, but at the end of the day, we've ended up with horses restricted to about 2.2 kilometres on an asphalt section where there is no impact from those horses. But I did notice coming through, I usually start riding the BVRT from about 10k south of Fernvale, opposite Lovers Lane. There's a road that goes up there. I was cycling through that last week, and a very large horse was galloping towards me, and I wasn't looking at the horse. I was looking at how much dirt it was throwing up as it made divots as it ran down the trail. And it was an area that looks like it's been recently resurfaced, and it was quite sad, really, to see that the money and the time that had gone into resurfacing only to have it dug up as a horse comes galloping along. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have horses on there. I had no problem with that horse. I pulled over. He said, "You don't need to, mate. You can carry on riding." I said, "Nah, you're all right. Give you right away." I respect everyone that's on the trail. But when you've got a financial limitation, you need to be very careful with the materials that you're selecting. And similarly, because the other thing I noticed then, it's something I observed on our own trail, because the horses do tend to want to give way, they move to the side. And it's the structurally weakest part of your trail surface. And so the erosion after the last rains that we had is quite significant. Just more money. Maybe it needs a different design solution. We looked at road intersections. Again, this is a Brisbane Valley one here. You kind of just cross your fingers, hope nothing's coming. We took a slightly different approach. We put in some balustrading. And the irony there is, now that it comes to me, is that I'm not aware of any accidents or any incidents with yours, and there's very little markings. We put this balustrading up, and we've had a child go along in their bike, blinded by the sun, straight into it, knocked out their front teeth. So, you do what you can, but there's always a risk, and making the community aware that there's a lot of risks out there is incredibly important. This is when we were selecting on the material for the gravel surface. We went through a few options there where we were changing the fines, changing the mixture to see how well it would bind. We took out prams, we took out mobility devices, wheelchairs, just made sure it was going to suit our purpose. So again, very different to other rail trails. We looked at inclusivity as a key factor when we were doing the design for us, and we wanted that from the beginning. So with the gravel, we did. The other materials, when we're talking about concrete and asphalt, we've got a good idea of how they're going to perform. They perform well. So it was really with the gravel, and then understanding what kind of mix that we want to get the surface that we wanted. So as a gravel rider, I wanted to hear it when I was riding along, and we all like that, get it underfoot. But at the same time, it needed to be at a level So I think we're maximum 5 mil on the stones that are in there. You could push a pram without the wheels locking up continually. So just running through these quite quickly, I'm just cognizant of time. User groups. Got to understand your user group. That's what I was saying. We wanted to be inclusive, so it's important to know who your user groups are. If you don't know who they are, you don't know who you're designing for. So we have horses in the controlled section. We have people that come for running, riding. We get a lot of single, lone females on the trail at all times of the day, whether it's dark or it's not dark. So making sure it was secure, as safe as it could be, was absolutely paramount. We've got people with disabilities. Take my own son there, he's autistic. It's challenging at times because it gets so busy on our trail, and it is quite narrow. It's like being in a vegetated tunnel for most of it, which is nice in the hot weather. But when you've got people with experiential disabilities, it can be quite challenging. But that being said, the design of it is sufficient to provide people with confidence to use it. So that was the user groups. The design element of that, and this is why it's so important, is that if you're not thinking about your end user, so it might be the person in the wheelchair, the chances are if you've got a gate, the lock's in the wrong place and then they can't access it. So it's just simple things. It's like when we did those barricading at the end of the trail when you get to a road interface. We could have gone with Australian standards, but my opinion was, as a rider, is it'll be a nightmare because you will get groups of people turning up or families turning up with young children who can't gather because the spaces aren't wide enough for that kind of use. So we spread them out. And what we tend to find is that people can wait on the side that we want them to, which is on the trail side, rather than on the road side. So it's a much safer way of doing it. All of those things led into our construction and design plan. And this is, within that is your detailed engineering, how we're going to deliver it from that perspective, but also your landscaping plan. So some of the design themes there that we looked at: what's our current environment, what's it made up from, what are we going to remove and what are we going to replace it with, just to make sure that not only is it reasonably endemic or native to the area to support local biota, but also to ensure from a maintenance point of view you're putting the right vegetation in there. Heritage, critical. This is where we incorporate the signage. Also has a very important part to play in wayfinding. We want everybody to know where you are at all times. If you run into an issue, you need to phone 000. It's a no-brainer. They know exactly where you are. So materialisation was critical. So we've looked at the environment, we've looked at the historic components, and then we look for materials that match those, complement them, or that can reimagine a space visually. So this is the Moranbah railway station. This was our initial concept design where we brought that materialisation together, your landscaping, celebrating your heritage components, the choice of materials, as you can see there. We've put down a new gravel. We've retained one of the tracks, signifying where that's where the trains used to come. And we've encased the other one in asphalt, so that it's actually like that in real life. It looks very similar. That's the point of imagining, doing the work, doing the design, and then sticking to the plan. The other thing that we did with other stations that are no longer there, many of the stations were removed from the 70s onwards, and they're only small ones where they picked up kids or they picked up bananas. We identified the location of all of those, and then we put in a concrete platform with a shade structure, so it was symbolic of our past. And there they are, there's one of them there. And again, what we've done here is we've slightly come off formation, off the original railway, so we can actually encase a section of the original railway alignment. I'm cautious not to say the original railway, because that railway wasn't laid in 1899. It was probably laid in about 2001. But that's where it is. Materialisation and the materiality of the bridges. So we looked at lots of different options. What suits best in which location. On the right was our concept with what we wanted to deliver, and on the left is precisely what we did deliver. It's more evident in these photographs here, where we fully reconstructed some of the bridges from the ground up. And then we had a design solution, the materiality that met the environment, gave it some historic context, and then we've used that opportunity for little things. I don't know if you can see on one of the timber slats, it's got the name of the bridge on there. And then similarly here, where we've gone over one of the very important bridges, we've used a material that's semi-transparent, so you can actually see the railway underneath. So again, it's just reminding people along the way that it used to be a railway and respecting that heritage. And that's just the same bridge under construction there. Again, you can see this one. This bridge is one of the first ones, erected in 1892. So it was critical that we respected that bridge. We had it fully refurbished. That was the design brief for that one. I think that bridge alone was about $1.6 million to refurbish and bring it back to life. So all the timber was reconstructed. But again, when you look at the photographs on Facebook, which count, that's the bridge. There it is there, superb. And that's just the gravel surface and how it's been, going over the last 18 months to 2 years. It's been faring exceptionally well despite some of the adverse weather conditions that we have been having. We talked about materiality in the surface, so we've got asphalt on the left. That's not actually a finished one, that had to pre-seal when it's been put down. It's a little bit more shiny now that it's had the seal put on there. But also on the right there, these are just for illustration purposes, where you've got a low-lying area that's likely to flood. Asphalt wasn't the preferred choice. Concrete was a little bit more expensive. But from an operational point of view, we've got longevity in those materials. Importantly, we embrace our culture and our heritage. We reuse wherever we can, and we recycle. So on the right there are the original lettering. Can't remember what year they went in, but they've been there for many, many decades. And of course, they are the sleepers that support it. So that's situated in the station. And again, it's another one of those photogenic kind of areas that people like to use. And that's what really adds into that branding that is there. It's what pushes our rail trail out globally, and it's what's bringing the visitors in, the dollars in, and then hopefully, we'll talk about this later, some income. That's the station, just quickly refurbished, so I can't take any credit for that apart from putting down a big fat yellow line. Tiffany's team did that one, brought the plants in, but the reason why I put that on there, not only because it's a nice photograph of the station, but just to recognise that when you're doing these projects, you want to use wherever you can local businesses to bring them in on that journey, because they then speak for your project. So this was a local business that helped out with all the vegetation. There was a lot of mowing and other things that went on in the background that you can't see, but it was critical. And what we see now is that there are local businesses. So down the other end of the trail from here down near Mobile, there's a business down there that's got a landscape business, and they're planting out. So they've taken that initiative, benefits us, keeps our costs down, but it makes the trail look absolutely amazing. And the wider community enjoy it because it's not done by the council, it's actually done by community. And that goes a long way. I would say that apart from building the thing and the excitement of that, this is probably the best day when you open it and you have your ceremony and people come along. And we had a lot of people come along. It wasn't just the dignitaries. It's essential that we invite them. It's the locals that come. And then the messages that we get afterwards about the experience, and that's just day one. And that's Northern Rivers Rail Trail.
I'm sure there are questions.
Thank you, that was very insightful. Now, I'm just wondering how you manage with your micro bats, because I know at Bentley that they closed the whole tunnel off, and funny, the tunnel was there before them, and we just have large moths in ours. So I was just wondering how you guys manage that, and whether EPA is involved or what happens there.
I think that was Siri giving you the answer. Yeah, it's a really good question. But let's make the distinction between Bentley and ours. So the Norton Gap had around 10,000 bats in their tunnel. We did environmental monitoring for about 2.5 years. At the maximum, we had about 180. Okay, so our tunnel is significantly greater in length. 180 bats versus 10,000. You just couldn't walk in their tunnel, let alone do anything else. So what we did to manage the bats, to make sure that they were happy, what we observed was whenever we went in the tunnel, they would fly, they would keep flying till they get to the other end, and then they would try and shoot over your head. Wouldn't try, they did, and it's very tall. So there are no apparatus out there that we could buy off the shelf to solve that situation and provide them with a refuge. So our ecologists with our depot came up with a few different design solutions, and then we trialled them for 18 months to see how they would go, and one of those designs worked really, really well. So there is, when you're in the tunnel, you've probably noticed there are like those reset spaces where the workers could stand when the trains were coming. So we used those, and we built an apparatus that fits into those that the bats can go into. And what we've observed is the bat numbers are really quite strong, and they are using those apparatus, and then they're not disturbed by people coming through, so the lights aren't having an effect on them. Now, I did hear recently some concern about the glowworms aren't there because all the lights are, killing the glowworms. But again, I was there last night, I was there on Monday, I can see the glowworms, so they're still there. So it's just being sensitive. The key thing I'll just add on to that was the construction phase, because you can't go in there with laser torches and start cutting up steel rails because of the bats. So again, we had ecologists on board that monitored, and then in the downtime for the bats, because the bats are not there all of the time, it's a seasonal thing. We worked through the night over, I think, a 10-day period while they were out doing the work.
No, thank you for that. We've actually, ours come and go as well. We don't have huge amounts, but ours actually have got used to the cyclists. They don't even move anymore. So it's just bizarre. We thought, when we first started using it, they did, but yeah, they just stay there in their little huddles, and they're great. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. An observation was that you dived straight into the feasibility and the viability of delivering a trail network. It was only until phase 3 that you started to talk about the users. As a designer, it's natural to champion the end user and then work through the stakeholder value chain to work out the feasibility and viability. Is that the natural mindset of a council to launch into the feasibility? Is that why we get over-engineered trails, or how does the user experience show up in these kind of considerations?
It's a good question, and nobody understands the natural mindset of any council. As I said right at the very beginning, I was very cognizant not to go step 1, step 2, step 3, because it's organic. So while it came across in the presentation that way, consumer preferences, potential social acceptance was at the forefront of that. Now, the project started before I came on board as an engineering project, and none of that had happened, and that was a fundamental error of the council. For whatever reason, I'm not pointing fingers, but I was asked to come on the project after a lot of that stuff had already been locked down. Oh, we've got this design, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. Hey, Ian, can you take over the project? My background, for those who don't know, is I'm a strategic land use planner. I manage strategic planning and urban design. That's my normal day job, apart from building rail trails and managing the building and environmental health unit. So I looked at that and said, well, what does the community think about this? What is the support from the community? Turns out it wasn't very good. And so that's when, from my background of policy development, which includes a lot of community engagement, was then to go out and start that process. Now, that was a difficult one for us because the anxiety and the disdain for the project had already set in, and the rumours are already out there. So not only was I taking a new project out there to start the conversation about what the future might look like, and I had to deal with the past. So that was very, very challenging. But I take your point. It is organic, and each one of those components that I mentioned comes in at all stages of the project. But at some point, you're going to crystallise them. You can't really do a business case and talk about the community acceptance if you haven't tested it. So we're fortunate. Rail Trails in New South Wales requires the state government to do their own consultation. Now, the consultation, respectfully, hopefully none of them are in the room, was woeful. But what it did is it put it on the radar that the government wants to do something. And so that enabled us to come in as the little council. We'll help you, okay? Work with me. So it was beneficial from that perspective. And then I started to work up, what's your expectations? What are your fears? So I can deal with those. Biosecurity plan as an example of those fears. We had a lot of concern about security. People are going to, as I said at the beginning, climb over the fence and steal my lawnmower. Another lady said to me when I was on her farm, she said, what are you going to do with all the nappies? I said, what nappies? She goes, well, the cyclists, they throw all their nappies and they're going to be hanging off the fences. I said, I'm perplexed. I don't know what you mean, nappies. She goes, well, you've seen them with those pants that they wear. They've got nappies. So I'm sorry, darling, but there's no nappies, okay? They're just padded shorts and they just keep on riding through. So it was capturing, and that's the nitty-gritty, but this is the reality of what happens and what people think, and they all start talking to each other and they feed off each other. So unpacking that early on to understand what the fears and concerns were to then build into the rest of that work was critical. But it is organic. It's as you can imagine, and I'm sure you well know. You from Trailworks? Is that where you're from? Or Blue Sky? There you go, legends. So it kind of rolls on right throughout the project.
You started the project, you had your funding up front, obviously done all your studies, you said you'd done your homework. When you got to finish that project, you said you had to ask for more money. How did you go back to your financial sponsors as such and say, we're 90% done, we do need more money? How did you divvy that up between, you had state government, local government, council? How did you go back and say, well, we want some more money, but we want X amount from you, X amount from you, or is it just an even amount from every group that come back in there? Did they fight that? Obviously they didn't, because it finished up.
It's probably a workshop in itself. Dealing with funding agencies is an interesting beast. Look, just without digressing too far, the funding was a significant challenge for us because the state and the federal government didn't come on board at the same time. So the original engineer's estimate was $13.5 million, and so $13 million, so just split it, $6.5 million each. And the state government, we signed a contract with them, funding agreement with them, about 18 months before the feds came on board. Now, according to the agreement, you couldn't spend $1 of state government money unless it was being matched by federal government money. So this is where you have to back yourself. So I looked at that and went, I don't really care. You've already given me the money, so now I'm going to spend it. So I did. And I'd report back to them. They were very interesting conversations. It's a pity I didn't record some of them. I'd report back to them and say, well, this is what I'm doing, and you need to come on board. At the same time, we were having conversations with the federal government about their funding and how slow that was coming on. And look, to keep it short, I just had to negotiate quite a lot of different variations on the fly until I got parity in the funding, and then started to split it between both. Now, we got to a situation, and this is where the price escalation came in. COVID hit, and it was difficult to get resources. It was difficult, whether it's materials or whether it's staffing, and we all know what happened with inflation. It just went to the moon. And our contracts did not allow for that, but nonetheless, inflation was going up on some of the materials that were coming in. So it was a case of saying to the state government, quite bluntly, we're doing this project and we need more money, or you can go and tell your Premier why it's not getting delivered, because we'll just down the tools. It was as simple as that. It was an ultimatum. So, and that's the thing with working, with government agencies. They're difficult, and they have a different agenda. They're a bureaucrat. But the politicians already signed off and said, we want this. You told the community, told the region, we're doing this. So I just reminded them, almost on a daily basis. Your Premier wants it. If you're not going to give me the money, get the Premier on the phone. We'll down the tools. So it took a while. There was a lot of backwards and forwards. But in the end, they came to the party, gave us the money.
I'll give you in a second, Johnny. I've got a question as well. This is a multi-shire council trail, and obviously Tweed's done this magnificent bit of work, and Richmond Council are doing theirs at the moment. How do you make sure that the trail is one trail? How do you make sure that the things that you've talked about, materiality and design, all those sorts of things, did you make those decisions on your own or in consultation with the other councils? And also the final question of that is, there's another council still to do really any building. How will we make sure that it's all one trail when it's done?
Yes, I'd like to take credit for everything, but it's not true. So what we did is we had a committee that we set up with state government partners, including our funding partners, relevant state government agencies, and the other councils. So they were invited along. And we very much made it clear to the government that we're spending more money on certain components that we might not otherwise needed to do, but the reason we were doing it so you don't need to replicate it each time you do a different section of the trail. So the work that Tiffany's team were doing on the branding and the marketing and all those kind of things, it's available to the other councils to adopt, and that's what they've chosen to adopt. Likewise, because they were on that journey when we were choosing the materials, they also adopted the same strategy. In fact, I think they even adopted the same contractors. So that's how we managed to maintain that one. In terms of the council that's not yet funded, Byron Shire Council, their position has changed over the last probably 5 or 6 years, from being positively no to positively this is something that we want to do. It's just a question of how do we deliver it. And I think they've reconciled that with the community now, whereby most of the trail that they will ultimately build will be on formation or on the railway alignment, but they will extend the area where the solar train currently runs. Doesn't mean the solar train will take it up. It might not be economically viable for them to do that. It's a very expensive exercise, and the government said, look, we'll give you funding for or they're considering giving funding for the trail, not necessarily for that component unless they've got an economic analysis, a business case that actually supports it commercially, because the government doesn't want to run it and the council can't afford to run it. So it's coming.
Last question.
Last question. I'm going to use the C word because car parking.
Yeah.
We learned this from our little spur line. Once we opened, 1 million questions asking, where am I going to park, where am I going to park? I could have answered and say, why don't you park further right there, right? But that's not the common thinking. But then there's also family with kids and all that. I'm where Mawulumba pretty much recognised as a trailhead. Been there, I go there on RDO when no one's there. I've never been there to an event. I don't know how the town feels about thousands of cars parked in front of them, all that. So have you guys dealt with that issue, and how are you guys managing it, or that's basically it, car park?
Absolutely. And I'll let Tiffany talk in more detail as to what's the future plans are. When we designed the trail, it was a white elephant. Let's not forget that. So everyone told us, no one's coming. And then the first complaint we had, there's nowhere to park. I didn't think you were coming. So we did provide some car parking early on. Our response initially was, we have a lot of roads that allow you to connect with the trail. You can park on the road reserve. There's no, unlike where I live on the Gold Coast, you don't have a parking meter every 10 metres, so you can literally park anywhere you like. But that then came with other inherent problems, that they were parking on areas where they shouldn't be parking, and then we were getting the complaints. So Tiffany's team, from an operational perspective, before we even opened, came on board and enabled us to provide more car parking at the station, and then they've continued to do that. So I'm sure there are plans on the way that Tiffany will talk to.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.